Among the 43 consultants who cycled through Hargrove Meridian's Vancouver office that autumn, only one stopped to hold the door for the man carrying the supply crates. She didn't know she was holding it for the man who was about to decide whether 1,200 people kept their jobs. Julian Hargrove had been standing outside his own building for 11 minutes before he walked in. Not because he was nervous, because he needed to remember what it felt like to approach a place without everyone already knowing your name. The acquisition had been announced 3 weeks earlier. Hargrove Capital was purchasing Meridian Logistics Group, a mid-sized freight coordination company headquartered in a glass tower on Burrard Street, 41 floors of people who had spent the last month either performing calm or genuinely feeling it. The integration team was already inside. The consultants were already billing, and somewhere between the press release and the board vote, Julian had realized he had no idea what he was actually buying. Not the revenue. He knew the revenue. Not the route data or the warehouse contracts or the debt structure sitting in the third quartile of their balance sheet. He knew all of that. What he did not know was whether the company had anything worth keeping beneath the numbers, whether the people inside it would still be worth something after the consultants left and the rebrand faded and ordinary Tuesday mornings resumed. He had read the culture assessments. They said, engaged, collaborative, forward-thinking. They always said that. Julian had commissioned enough of them to know that culture assessments measured the distance between what a company wanted to believe about itself and what it was willing to put on paper. They did not measure what happened in the elevator when nobody important was watching. So on the Monday morning that Hargrove Capital's integration period officially began, Julian did not arrive as Julian Hargrove. He arrived as James Holbrook, a logistics operations contractor brought in to assist with facility and workflow review. His assistant had arranged the badge. His CFO thought he had gone to Toronto for a family matter. He wore a charcoal work jacket, carried a clipboard, and had left his watch, the one people recognized, in the drawer of his desk at home. He took the service entrance. The supply crates were real. The building manager, a quiet man named Gord who had been told only that James was part of the review team, had handed Julian a stack of printer paper boxes and pointed him toward the third floor. Julian had said thank you and meant it. The woman who held the door was named Priya Sandhu. He would not learn that until Tuesday. On Monday, she was simply the only person in a hallway of 20 who looked up from her phone long enough to notice that someone's hands were full. "Here," she said. And she didn't wait for acknowledgement. She just held it. Julian said thank you. She nodded and walked toward the stairwell. That was all. It was a small thing, ordinary. He set the boxes down beside the third-floor storage room and stood for a moment in the corridor, watching people move past with the particular purposeful energy of professionals who were aware they were being evaluated. Backs a little straighter, voices a little clearer, everyone performing readiness. Except for the woman who had just held the door, who was already gone. Julian Hargrove had spent 20 years in acquisition and capital strategy. He had walked into 61 companies in various states of distress, transition, or inflation. He had learned to read rooms faster than most people read headlines, and what he understood, standing in that hallway with printer paper at his feet, was that the door holder had not performed anything. She had simply done a thing because it needed doing. In a building full of people trying to look like leaders, that was a quality worth locating. He picked up the boxes and went to find out who she was. Priya Sandhu had not slept well. She rarely did during high-pressure weeks, and this week had been high pressure since before it started. She had been with Meridian for 3 years, working as a senior operations analyst in the freight coordination division. She knew the Midwest and prairie routes the way some people knew highway exits, not from studying them, but from having driven them 1,000 times in her head, reconciling dispatch data against weather delays and driver reports and the particular stubbornness of rural road infrastructure in February. She was good at her job. She had been told this by her direct supervisor, Garrett Sims, exactly once in passing, and then watched him present her quarterly analysis to the Integration Steering Committee as a team finding without her name attached to it. That had happened 6 days ago. Priya had stayed at her desk until 8:30 that evening, going back through the shared folder, making sure she wasn't misremembering. She wasn't. Her name was in the version history. It was not on the slide deck. She had written a summary email to Garrett the next morning. careful and factual, no accusations. He had replied 4 hours later, "Good catch. I'll flag it for the next internal review." The kind of sentence that meant nothing and was designed to. She had not followed up. Not because she had forgiven it, but because she was still calculating what it would cost her. The integration period felt like a performance everyone was auditioning for, and nobody had received the script. The consultants were everywhere, young, expensive, moving fast through hallways in packs, asking for data she had already compiled, in formats she had already prepared, then presenting it back to leadership in language that made it sound like their discovery. Priya had watched it happen twice in 3 days. She had stopped being surprised by it and started just recording the times and dates in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She was not angry in a loud way. She was angry in the careful, precise way of someone who has learned that loudness closes doors. Julian spent Monday morning watching without introducing himself. He moved between floors with the clipboard and the Hargrove Capital Contractor badge, which nobody questioned because people rarely questioned a badge in a building that had just been acquired and was currently full of people they had never seen before. He listened to hallway conversations. He sat in the back of a cross-department sync meeting that nobody seemed to want to be in. He ate lunch in the staff cafeteria at a corner table and listened to a logistics coordinator named Boz complain to a colleague about a routing system that hadn't been updated in 4 years and caused a cascade of delays every time there was a weather event in the northern Saskatchewan corridors. "They know," Boz said. "We filed 3 separate reports. It just disappears into the system." His colleague shrugged. "File another one." "What's the point?" It was said without a question mark. That was the part Julian wrote down. He had a notebook too. By Tuesday he had started to identify the shape of the problem. It was not a people problem exactly. There were competent people here, genuinely competent, the kind who stayed late not to be seen but because they were in the middle of something and couldn't leave it unfinished. The problem was architectural. The company had built a culture that rewarded visibility over accuracy, confidence over understanding, and the right kind of performance over the right kind of work. He watched a senior consultant named Webb dominate a stakeholder presentation with a framework he had assembled in 2 days from data he clearly did not fully understand. Webb had good eye contact. He spoke in declarative sentences. He paused at the right moments. The executives in the room nodded with the particular focus of people who were less interested in the content than in the confidence with which it was being delivered. When a quiet voice from the back of the room, Priya Sandhu, sitting beside the wall with a printed copy of something, said, "The Western distribution projections don't account for the seasonal closure pattern on Highway 16, which shifts the effective window by about 3 weeks." Webb smiled the way people smile when they want to shrink something without appearing to. "That's a great ground-level note," he said. "We can incorporate that kind of color in the next pass." Color. Julian underlined the word in his notebook. After the meeting, he followed her at a distance down the hallway to the elevators. Not to speak to her, just to see what she did next. She went back to her desk. She opened the document she had been working on before the meeting. She put her earbuds in. She did not complain to anyone. She did not go find a colleague to vent to. She went back to work. And that, somehow, was the thing that stayed with Julian through the rest of the afternoon. Not the dismissal, but the way she had already moved past it. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she was not going to let it stop her from finishing what she had started. He had been in 61 companies. He had never seen that quality rewarded by the companies that needed it most. On Wednesday, Julian made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one. A human one. He was carrying a second round of crates. Gord had become accustomed to his presence and had begun assigning him light logistics tasks with a straightforwardness Julian found genuinely refreshing, and he took the wrong elevator bank and ended up on the executive floor instead of the 4th. A woman in a fitted blazer he recognized as Diane Forsyth, Peridian's outgoing COO, looked at him with the particular brief attention people give to service workers, enough to register that he was there, not enough to actually see him. "Are those for the East Conference Room?" she said. "No," Julian said. "Wrong floor, sorry." She had already looked away. He took the stairs back down. In the stairwell, he passed two members of Webb's consulting team deep in a conversation about which Meridian employees were integration compatible, a phrase Julian had not heard before and hoped he would not need to hear again. One of them mentioned Priya Sandhu by name. Too technical, the other one said, doesn't translate well to the new leadership model. The first one agreed. Julian kept walking. That evening, after the building had mostly emptied, he sat in a small internal meeting room on the fourth floor and opened his laptop. He pulled up the version history on the shared integration folder. It took him 40 minutes, but he found it, Priya Sandhu's name appearing in the original root analysis document, then disappearing in the version submitted to the steering committee. The changes had been made by Garrett Sims at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday. He found two other instances. Same pattern, different documents, same editor. He kept looking. There was a complaint filed through the internal culture channel 6 weeks before the acquisition was announced. A member of the dispatch team describing being blamed for a software routing error that the IT logs clearly showed had originated upstream. The complaint had been marked reviewed and closed. The word used in the internal note was resolved. Nothing in the thread suggested it had been resolved for the person who filed it. It had been resolved for the people who processed it. Julian closed the laptop and sat for a while in the quiet of the empty meeting room. He had told himself when he started the acquisition that Meridian's culture problems were surface level, that a change in leadership, a refocus of values, a new communication framework would be enough. He had told himself this because it was convenient to believe, and because the due diligence reports had said so, and because saying so made the deal simpler. He had been wrong, and more than that, he had been the kind of wrong that required effort to maintain. He had looked at the culture assessments and chosen to find them convincing. Thursday was the integration showcase, a day-long internal event organized to present the future direction of the combined company to Meridian's senior staff and the Hargrove integration team. It was held in the main atrium, which had been rearranged with cocktail tables and a small stage and catering that cost more than Boz's monthly salary and had been approved in the same week that a request for updated routing software had been declined for the third consecutive quarter. Julian wore the contractor jacket and stood near the back. Webb presented first. He spoke about synergy and scalability and the enormous opportunity represented by the integration. He mentioned several of his own strategic frameworks by name. He received sustained applause. Priya Sandhu was not scheduled to present. She was in the audience, standing near the left side of the room with a coffee she hadn't touched, wearing a dark blazer over a gray top. Julian had noticed she owned several versions of the same practical outfit, not because she lacked style, but because she was spending her cognitive budget on things that were not what she looked like. Garrett Sims presented second. His segment covered Western route optimization, the exact analysis Julian had traced back to Priya in the shared folder. The slides were good, the data was solid. Her name did not appear once. Julian watched Priya's face during the presentation. She did not react. Her expression stayed level, and she kept her eyes on the screen, and the only sign that she had noticed anything at all was the way she shifted her weight slightly to her left foot and then back. The quiet physical language of someone absorbing something they have absorbed before. Afterward, there was the usual networking hour. Julian moved through the room with his clipboard, listening. He stopped near a cluster of consultants and Meridian managers who were discussing which members of the operations team would be recommended for the senior track. Webb's name came up. Garrett's name came up. When someone mentioned Priya, the response was measured in kind and completely empty. Great detail person. Not quite the strategic profile we're building toward. Julian set his clipboard on a nearby table. He walked toward Priya, who was standing near the window looking out at the gray October harbor. She glanced at him when he stopped beside her. A brief, assessing look, the kind you give a stranger when you're not sure if they're about to say something you'll have to respond to. The seasonal closure data you raised in Tuesday's meeting, Julian said. The Highway 16 window. Was that in the materials before Webb's presentation? Priya looked at him more carefully. It was in my original route analysis, from 6 weeks ago. And in Garrett's presentation today. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, without the citation. Has this happened before? She studied him. Why are you asking? Julian had been preparing an answer to this question since Tuesday. He had several good ones: plausible, contractor appropriate, professionally neutral. He used none of them. "Because I've been trying to understand what this company actually is," he said. "Not what it looks like from the outside." Priya held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "That's a strange thing for a logistics contractor to be interested in." She was not wrong. He didn't answer. She looked back at the harbor. "It happens," she said, finally. "Enough that I've started keeping records. Not because I think it'll change anything. Just because I need to know I'm not imagining it." Julian thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket. "You're not imagining it," he said. She turned back to him, and for a moment something shifted in her expression. Not relief, exactly, but the particular careful recognition of someone who has been told the truth in a place where truth is not usually offered for free. "James," she said, because that was the name on his badge, "who are you actually?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a container ship moved slowly through the inner harbor, heading west toward open water. "I'll tell you Friday," he said. He had not planned to say that, but it felt for the first time all week like the honest answer. On Thursday evening, Julian did two things. He called his CFO and told him to block Friday morning for a full integration leadership meeting, unscheduled, attendance mandatory. Then he called his assistant and asked her to prepare one additional slide for the board package, a supplementary document she did not ask questions about and he did not explain. He did not sleep well either. Friday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of Vancouver October morning that makes the mountains visible from the harbor and reminds you that you live somewhere worth protecting. Julian arrived at Meridian at 7:15. Not through the service entrance, through the front. He was wearing his own clothes. He had his watch on. He had left the clipboard at home. The receptionist looked up as he entered and then looked again. The double take of someone who has been seeing the same face in contractor clothing all week and is only now matching it to the photograph that has been circulating in internal communications for 6 months. He took the main elevator to the executive floor. The meeting was scheduled for 9. By 8:50 the room was full, Meridian's senior leadership on one side, Julian's integration directors and legal team on the other, and Webb's consulting group arranged along the back wall with the particular alertness of people who do not yet know whether today is going to be good news or bad news for them personally. At 8:57, Priya Sandhu was escorted in by Julian's assistant and shown to a seat at the main table. She looked at Julian when she entered. He held her gaze for a moment and gave a small nod. She sat. Diane Forsyth, who had asked James with the crates if he was headed to the East Conference Room, sat 3 seats away and was very carefully not reacting to anything. Julian began without preamble. "My name is Julian Hargrove. I've spent this week in this building as James Holbrook, a logistics contractor, because I needed to understand what Meridian actually is before I decide what it becomes." He paused. "I want to tell you what I found." The room was very quiet. He talked for 12 minutes. He covered the routing software complaints. 3 filed, 3 closed without resolution. He covered the culture channel complaint that had been marked resolved when nothing had been resolved for the person who filed it. He covered the version history. He pulled up 2 slides, the original route analysis document with Priya Sandhu's name clearly visible and the steering committee version with her name absent. He did not editorialize. He let the documents speak. Garrett Sims looked at the table. Webb looked at his phone and seemed to remember that he should not be looking at his phone and put it away. Julian looked at Priya. "Ms. Sandhu, would you walk us through the Western route analysis? Your version." She stood. She had the document open on her laptop, which she connected to the room's display system with the practiced ease of someone who has done this 100 times and never once been asked to be at the front of the room for it. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. She walked through the data clearly: the seasonal corridor patterns, the driver feedback loop gaps, the upstream scheduling errors that were being absorbed by warehouse teams and frontline drivers who had the least institutional authority and therefore the most exposure when something went wrong. She did not perform confidence. She simply knew what she was talking about. Julian watched the room. The integration directors were taking notes. The legal team was paying the particular kind of attention that meant something actionable was forming. Even two of Webb's consultants, to their credit, had stopped looking at the table and were actually listening. When Priya finished, Julian said, "This is what the company has been doing with work like this. I want to know how that became acceptable." Nobody answered immediately. Then Diane Forsythe said quietly, "It was never explicitly acceptable. It was just never explicitly unacceptable." Julian nodded. He had expected something defensive. The honesty surprised him. He wrote it down. Garrett Sims resigned before the end of the month. He issued a statement about pursuing new opportunities, which was accurate in the technical sense. Webb's firm was not retained for the second phase of the integration, a decision Julian made with a directness that surprised his own legal team. The routing software update was approved in the first week of November. The culture reporting channel was rebuilt from scratch, with a new protocol that required documented follow-up and a 30-day resolution timeline that was actually enforced. Baz, the logistics coordinator from the cafeteria, was asked to join a cross-functional operations working group because the people closest to the system's failure points turned out to know more about fixing them than anyone who had been managing from a distance. Priya Sandhu was appointed Senior Operations Lead for the Prairie and Western Freight Integration, the role that matched the work she had already been doing without the title or the salary that should have accompanied it. Julian made certain the appointment came through the integration restructuring process, evaluated by a committee that did not include him because he had already decided that her success would not look like a favor from the man who owned the building. She thanked him when she heard. He said it was the outcome the data supported. She said she knew that. He said he was glad she knew that. There was a pause in the conversation that had nothing to do with the work. It started the way things start when two people have been honest with each other in a setting where honesty costs something. Coffee that ran long, a walk along the seawall because neither of them was ready to go back inside. Julian told her about his brother, who had tried to join the company and failed, and about the years he had spent confusing being alone at the top with being objective. She told him about her parents, who had come to Vancouver from Punjab with 2 suitcases and a belief that competence was its own argument, and about the years she had spent discovering that this was only partly true. She told him about the notebook. He told her about his. They both laughed at that. It was the first time either of them had laughed all week, and it landed differently for it. He was careful. She required him to be. There was a version of this that could become something Julian held over her without meaning to, and she named it directly one evening in early December, standing at the edge of the seawall with the city lights reflecting cold and sharp in the water below. "I like who you are when you're just a person," she said. "I need to know that the rest of it doesn't change that." Julian looked at the water. "I need to know that too," he said. "I'm not sure I always have been." She turned to look at him. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still standing here." He did not report to any common structure, she answered to. He kept it that way. At work he was Julian Hargrove, the acquirer, and she was Priya Sandhu, Senior Operations Lead, and the professional distance between them was real and deliberate and respected by both. Outside work he was, more and more, just someone who had learned to listen before he spoke and had found, unexpectedly, that this made almost everything better. 6 months after the integration closed, Julian walked through the Meridian atrium on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The routing software had been live for 4 months. The complaint channel had logged 11 reports, all followed up, 8 resolved, 3 still in progress with documentation visible to the filers. A freight coordinator from the Northern Alberta division had sent an email to the operations team that morning thanking them for the schedule adjustment on the Highway 16 corridor. It was addressed to the team. Priya's name was in the CC line. Julian stopped near the main entrance. The same crate trolley he had used in his first week sat beside the service corridor. Gord was signing off on a delivery manifest nearby. "James," Gord said out of habit, and then caught himself. "Sorry, Mr. Hargrove." "Gord," Julian said, "if it matters, you were the first person in this building who treated me like a colleague." Gord looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You were the first executive in 5 years who actually carried something." Julian smiled. He went to find Priya. She was already on her way to a meeting. Laptop under one arm, coffee in hand, moving through the building with the particular ease of someone who no longer had to prove she belonged there, because the work had already made the argument. She glanced at him as they passed in the hallway. A small look, private, specific, the kind that carries a whole conversation in a single second. He kept walking. She kept walking. Outside, the October mountains had already given way to November ones, harder, colder, less forgiving, and somehow more honest about what they were. He had spent 20 years acquiring things. It had taken a week as a man with a clipboard and borrowed crates to understand that the most valuable thing in any company he had ever walked into was not on any balance sheet, and that he had very nearly missed it entirely. He did not miss it again. I keep thinking about the notebook. Not Julian's. Mine. The small one I carried in my jacket pocket during a job I stayed at 2 years too long, where I wrote down dates and times and document version numbers because I needed proof I wasn't losing my mind. Most of us have had a version of that notebook. Most of us have never shown it to anyone. What stayed with me about Priya's story isn't the ending. It's the Wednesday evening when she opened the shared folder alone in her apartment with a train rattling the windows and found her name had been quietly moved to a footnote. No confrontation, no explanation, just the clean, administrative erasure of someone who had done the work and was considered unlikely to make a scene about it. She made a note. She kept going. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of integrity that costs something every single day, and most people watching from the outside never see the price tag. There's a version of this story where Priya eventually hardens, where she learns to play the game, to front-load her name on everything, to stop trusting people who say we can incorporate that color in the next pass. A lot of people do learn that. It's a rational response to a repeated lesson. But she didn't harden. She kept the notebook and she kept doing the work, and I think those two things together, the clear-eyed record-keeping and the refusal to let it make her smaller, are what Julian actually recognized in her. Not naivety. Precision. The combination of someone who understands exactly what's being done to her and chooses not to become it. Julian's part of this matters too, and I don't want to let it go too easily. He had the culture assessments. He had the due diligence reports. He had every institutional signal that things were fine, and he chose to find those signals convincing because it was convenient. That's not villainy. It's the ordinary human preference for information that makes things simpler. But there were real people absorbing the cost of his convenience. Boz filing his third software complaint into a system that had learned to close tickets without solving problems. The dispatch worker who got blamed for a routing error she didn't cause. Walt, in the original story's language, the person at the bottom of the building who knows exactly how the building runs and has been told, quietly and repeatedly, that this knowledge doesn't qualify as insight. What changed things wasn't Julian's power. It was his willingness to be wrong in a place where being wrong cost him something. His assumptions, his comfort, the tidy narrative of a clean acquisition. That takes a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with authority. It's the courage of actually looking. I think the three things this story keeps returning to: honesty with yourself about what you've chosen not to see, the intelligence to understand a system's real architecture rather than its stated one, and the steadiness to keep going when the system pushes back. Those aren't qualities that belong to CEOs or analysts or any particular role. They're the things that determine whether a person makes a place better or just moves through it. Priya kept her notebook. Julian finally opened his eyes. The building didn't change overnight, but it started to change because two people, on different floors and for different reasons, decided that what was true mattered more than what was convenient. That's the only way it ever starts.